Before dawn in southern Iraq, a man with a pick steps onto ground that contains 5 million dead, and he listens before he swings. This is not poetry, it is a working practice. 5 million bodies lie layered into the same 6 square kilometers of earth, 14 centuries deep, buried so densely that gravediggers sometimes strike bone before they reach the depth they need. Generation upon generation, pressed into clay and limestone, wrapped in white cotton shrouds, lowered into the ground with prayers that have not changed since the 7th century. The soil here is not soil in any conventional sense. It is calcium and keratin and the mineral residue of human lives compacted into something closer to sediment than dirt. Among the men who dig into it every day, who earn their wages by opening the earth and closing it again, it is understood that the earth pushes back. This is Wadi Salaam, the Valley of Peace, the largest cemetery on the planet, sprawling across the outskirts of Najaf in southern Iraq, and the stories that come from inside it suggest that peace may be the one thing this valley has never known. To reach Wadi Salaam, you approach from the north, along a highway that cuts through flat, sun-scorched terrain between Baghdad and the holy cities of the south. The land is the color of old bone, pale and dry, broken only by irrigation canals carrying Euphrates water to date palm groves that cling to the riverbanks in dark green clusters. Dust coats the tongue. Diesel exhaust thickens every breath. Heat rises from the asphalt in visible waves, distorting the horizon so that distant structures shimmer and float as if unmoored from the ground. In summer, temperatures push past 50 degrees Celsius. The light is not golden here. It is white, bleached, merciless, flattening shadows to nothing, and turning the sky into a featureless sheet of glare. Najaf appears gradually. First, the golden dome of the shrine of Imam Ali, catching the sun from 20 kilometers out, a single point of brilliance in the pale landscape. Then the low sprawl of the city itself, a dense grid of concrete and brick pressed against the western shore of the Bahr al-Najaf, a seasonal lake that fills with winter rain and dries to a salt crust by June. The city has existed in some form for over 4,000 years. Alexander the Great marched his army through its gates. The Mongols sacked it, the Ottomans taxed it for centuries, and the British bombed it during the revolt of 1920. Najaf has survived everything, and the reason it has survived everything is the same reason millions of people have chosen to be buried here: the tomb of Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, the first Imam of Shia Islam. The shrine sits at the heart of the city like a stone dropped into still water, and the cemetery radiates outward from it in every direction, an ocean of graves that begins at the shrine walls and does not end for kilometers. Walk south from the shrine's golden entrance, and you are among the dead within minutes, the noise of the living city fading behind you, replaced by the dry rustle of wind across stone and the distant sound of hammers where new mausoleums are being built. From ground level, you cannot see the edges. From the air, the scale becomes something the mind resists processing. Satellite imagery shows a grid of tan and gray stretching to the horizon, broken by narrow access roads and punctuated by mausoleums of varying sizes, from modest family crypts to elaborate multi-story structures with tiled domes and carved sandstone facades. UNESCO placed it on the tentative World Heritage List. Guinness World Records confirmed what anyone who has stood at its edge already knows: there is no cemetery on Earth that compares. The belief that drives the burials is specific and deeply held. Shia tradition teaches that proximity to the tomb of Imam Ali confers spiritual benefit upon the dead, easing their passage through the stages that follow death. Families transport bodies from across Iraq, from Iran, from Pakistan, from Bahrain, from Lebanon, from every corner of the Shia world, sometimes at enormous expense, sometimes across active war zones, to secure a plot within the valley. Approximately 500,000 new burials take place each year. The logistics alone are staggering. Funeral processions clog the roads into Najaf daily, the coffins draped in green or black fabric, carried on the shoulders of mourners who walk the final stretch to the cemetery on foot, chanting prayers that echo off the walls of the mausoleums and dissolve into the dry air. But the living do not stay in the valley long. Visitors describe a particular quality to the air inside the cemetery that they struggle to put into words. The temperature drops as you move deeper, which is partly a matter of shade from the tightly packed mausoleums, but the drop feels disproportionate, and the stone and the earth beneath it seem to absorb something more than sunlight. Sound behaves differently. The city noise of Najaf, the traffic and the calls to prayer, does not so much fade as it gets swallowed, replaced by a hush that settles around you like water filling a basin. Tour guides, when they exist, tend to keep moving. There are sections of the old cemetery where even the guides will not go after 4 in the afternoon, though they will not explain why in any way that satisfies a Western journalist's definition of a reason. The gravediggers do, and it is from the gravediggers that the other stories come. They work in shifts, typically beginning before dawn to avoid the worst of the heat, though in the deep months of summer even the pre-dawn hours offer temperatures above 40 degrees. The work is physical and unrelenting. The soil, calcium-rich and hardened by centuries of compression, and the relentless Iraqi sun resists the shovel. Picks are standard equipment. A single grave takes 2 men several hours to excavate, longer if they encounter the remains of previous burials, which happened with regularity in a cemetery that has been receiving bodies since the time of the Umayyad Caliphate. The older sections are layered so densely that digging a new grave means negotiating around fragments of those who came before. Bones that crumble to powder at the touch and shroud fabric that is yellowed to the color of parchment. The gravediggers of Wadi Salaam are, by necessity, practical men. They are not mystics. They are laborers, many of them driven to the work by Iraq's chronic unemployment rather than any spiritual calling. They eat their lunches sitting on headstones. They smoke cigarettes in the narrow alleys between the tombs. They know the cemetery like farmers reading soil, by texture, by resistance, by the particular smell of earth at different depths. They are not, by temperament or occupation, people inclined to invention, which makes what they report difficult to dismiss. The stories are not new. They predate the Al Jazeera documentary by decades, possibly by centuries. Older gravediggers speak of warnings passed down from the men who trained them, informal rules that have no basis in any written code, but that every worker in the valley eventually learns. Do not dig alone after midnight. Do not look directly at a shape you see on a grave. If something strikes you, do not strike back. If a sound comes from beneath the soil, finish the burial quickly and leave. These are not folklore in the way that outsiders might understand the term. They are occupational safety protocols, earned through experience, refined through repetition, and taken as seriously as any instruction about shoring up a collapsing excavation. In 2019, Al Jazeera sent a documentary crew to Wadi Salaam and conducted interviews with gravediggers who had worked the valley for years. The accounts they gathered were consistent in their details, even among workers who operated in different sections of the cemetery and did not know one another. What emerged was a pattern of experiences that did not fit neatly into any category the workers themselves could name. One gravedigger described being struck across the face while digging a grave at night. There was no one near him. His colleague, working 30 meters away, heard him cry out and came running. The mark on his cheek was visible. No explanation was offered by either man beyond the obvious impossibility of the event. Another described the shape that he saw crouching on a freshly filled grave in the hour before dawn, a shape that was not human in its proportions but moved with a fluidity that suggested something alive. When he shouted, it did not flee. It turned toward him, and he saw, or believed he saw, a face that shifted as he looked at it, features rearranging themselves like smoke caught in a change of wind. He did not approach. He left the area and did not return to that section for weeks. Others described sounds, not the sounds that a cemetery might reasonably produce, the settling of stone, the creak of old wood, the wind moving through narrow gaps between structures, but sounds that carried intention, knocking from beneath sealed graves. A low, continuous murmur, as if a crowd were holding a conversation just below the threshold of comprehensibility, audible only in the deep stillness of the hours after midnight. One gravedigger said the murmuring was worst in the oldest sections, where the graves were stacked 3 and 4 deep, and that it rose and fell in a rhythm that reminded him, though he could not say why, of breathing. A third account involved a burial that went wrong, if that is the right word. As the body was being lowered into the grave, the dead woman's hand, according to the gravedigger telling the story, struck him across the face with force sufficient to leave a bruise. The body had been washed and wrapped in the traditional manner. Rigor mortis had long since passed. The gravedigger, a man who had interred hundreds of bodies, could not explain the movement. He completed the burial. He went home. He did not sleep that night, or, by his account, for several nights after. The gravediggers have names for what they encounter: Tantal, Guerreria. The words vary by region and dialect, but the descriptions converge on something that resists easy classification. These are not ghosts in the Western sense, not transparent figures drifting through walls. They are physical presences, capable of striking, of being seen, of occupying space. They are associated with the newly dead, appearing most frequently near fresh graves in the hours between sunset and the first call to prayer. They do not speak. They do not communicate in any recognizable way. They are, in the accounts of the men who encounter them, simply there, doing something to or near the dead that the living are not meant to witness. There are other accounts, less dramatic but no less persistent. Gravediggers speak of tools that move between shifts, shovels found in locations where no one left them, markers placed on fresh graves that are found the next morning on graves 20 meters away. One worker described hearing his own name called from inside an open grave he was preparing, spoken clearly and in a voice he recognized as belonging to a man he had buried the previous week. He told the Al Jazeera crew this story with the flat, matter-of-fact delivery of a man describing traffic on his commute. He was not performing fear. He was reporting an event he considered unremarkable in the context of his workplace. Turnover among gravediggers in the valley is exceptionally high. Workers frequently abandon the job after a single encounter, accepting the financial consequences of unemployment rather than returning to the cemetery at night, and yet the cemetery does not lack for gravediggers. Iraq's economy, devastated by decades of war, sanctions, and sectarian violence, provides a steady supply of men desperate enough to take the work, aware of the stories, and hoping they will be the exception. The human mind finds patterns in chaos and agency in randomness. Gravediggers work long hours in extreme heat, performing physically exhausting labor in an environment saturated with death and religious significance. They work at night, in poor lighting, in a landscape of repeating forms where the play of shadows across identical headstones could produce the illusion of movement, of shape, of presence. The stories circulate among the workers, creating an expectation framework that primes new arrivals to interpret ambiguous stimuli as supernatural encounters. This is not a weak argument. It accounts for the atmospheric conditions, the psychological pressures, the cultural context. Sleep deprivation alone, in heat above 40 degrees, during physically demanding manual labor, is sufficient to produce hallucinations of considerable vividness. Combine that with the knowledge that you are standing in a field of 5 million corpses, and the inherited folklore of a culture that takes the post-mortem activity of the spirit seriously, and the surprise would be if gravediggers did not report strange experiences. But the accounts collected by Al Jazeera and by Iraqi journalists before them have a quality that pure hallucination rarely produces: physical evidence, bruises, scratches, marks that appear on skin in contexts where no physical contact has occurred, witnessed by colleagues who were present at the time. A hallucination does not leave a handprint on a man's face. The Islamic theological framework offers its own interpretation, and it is one that predates the modern cemetery by centuries. In Islamic eschatology, the period between death and resurrection is called the barzakh, an intermediate state during which the soul remains connected to the body and undergoes a process of questioning and reckoning. The graves are not empty vessels in this tradition. They are occupied, actively, by entities in a state that is neither life nor death, but something for which the living do not have adequate language. The Quran references beings called jinn, created from smokeless fire, occupying a realm parallel to human existence, capable of interacting with the physical world under certain conditions. The gravediggers' accounts, within this framework, are not paranormal. They are theological. The valley is doing exactly what it was always expected to do. There is, perhaps, a third lens through which to view Wadi Salaam, one that belongs to neither the skeptic nor the theologian. It is the lens of accumulated presence. Beneath those 6 square kilometers lies 1,400 years of continuous burial in soil that preserves rather than dissolves, in a climate so dry that organic material desiccates rather than decays. In a geological context where the limestone substrate acts as a natural sealant, the cemetery is not a passive receptacle, it is a concentration. 5 million bodies, an estimated 20 million, if you include the centuries of burials that predate modern record-keeping, compressed into an area smaller than some airports. Set aside questions of consciousness, the soul, electromagnetic residue of biological systems, about the chemical processes of decomposition and their effects on local geology. This is not a normal piece of ground. It cannot be. The sheer density of human remains per cubic meter of soil places Wadi Salaam in a category that has no comparisons and therefore no baseline for what should or should not be experienced there. No scientific investigation of Wadi Salaam has ever been conducted. No university has sent a team with seismographs, thermal cameras, or electromagnetic field sensors. No parapsychologist has spent a night among the graves with recording equipment. The reasons are partly practical, partly political, partly cultural. Iraq has spent the better part of 4 decades at war. The cemetery is a sacred site within one of the holiest cities in Shia Islam, and the idea of Western researchers installing monitoring equipment among the graves of the faithful would be met with resistance that ranges from polite refusal to outright hostility. The evidence, such as it is, comes from the men who work there and the journalists who have occasionally listened to them. It is not peer-reviewed. It is not replicable. It is also not going away. The cemetery continues to grow. Satellite imagery taken over successive years shows the boundary pushing outward, consuming the scrubland and the scattered date palms that once bordered it, creeping toward the modern infrastructure of Najaf itself. New sections are opened as old ones reach capacity. Construction crews build mausoleums while gravediggers work 50 meters away. The living and the dead negotiate space in a landscape where both populations are expanding, and the dead, by sheer numbers, are winning. During the sectarian violence that followed the 2003 invasion, the cemetery received bodies at a rate that overwhelmed the gravediggers. Mass graves were dug. Families buried their own dead without waiting for professional assistance. In some sections, the ground was opened and closed so many times in a single week that the soil lost its structure entirely, collapsing into soft, unstable depressions that the gravediggers call breathing ground, because it shifts underfoot as if something beneath it is moving. The war years added another layer to the valley's already saturated soil. Between 2006 and 2008, at the height of the sectarian killing, Najaf's morgues could not process bodies fast enough, and the overflow came to Wadi Salaam in trucks and ambulances and, on some days, in the backs of private cars. Gravediggers who worked during those years speak of it with a particular heaviness that has nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with the scale of human suffering they witnessed. Children, whole families, bodies so damaged by explosions that identification was impossible and the shrouds were wrapped around fragments rather than forms. The cemetery absorbed it all. The earth opened and the earth closed, and the headstones multiplied like cells dividing. The Islamic State siege of 2014 brought fighters to the edges of the cemetery itself. Militiamen used the mausoleums as defensive positions. Bullets struck headstones that were older than most European nations, and through it all, the burials continued. Funeral processions walked past armed checkpoints. Gravediggers worked within earshot of gunfire. The dead kept arriving because the dead do not wait for peace. Today, if you walk through the oldest sections of Wadi Salaam, you walk on ground that is more calcium phosphate than clay, ground that has been opened and closed so many times that it no longer holds its shape the way Earth should. The headstones in these areas are illegible, their inscriptions eroded by centuries of wind and sand until only the vaguest outlines of Arabic script remain. Some have sunk into the soil, half swallowed, the earth reclaiming them the way it reclaims everything eventually. The air in the narrow passages between the old mausoleums is cooler than it should be, shaded by the structures on either side, but also carrying something else, a quality that visitors struggle to articulate and that the gravediggers do not bother trying to explain. They feel it. They have always felt it. The living are guests in Wadi Salaam, and the valley tolerates them the way any host tolerates visitors who will eventually leave. The gravediggers finish their shifts. They wash the pale dust from their hands and arms. They drink tea in the small shops that line the road outside the cemetery gates, sitting with their backs to the valley, talking about football scores and the price of fuel and the small, urgent concerns of people who are very much alive. They do not talk about what happens in the valley unless they are asked, and sometimes not even then. What would they say? That the earth moves? That the dead are not still? That something lives among the graves that does not have a name anyone trusts? Some of the gravediggers will feel something they cannot explain, and most of them will not speak of it, and the ones who do will not be believed by anyone who has not stood in that valley at the hour before dawn, alone. 500,000 new bodies will enter the valley this year. Next year, the year after that, the earth will open, the earth will close, with 5 million dead beneath their feet and the golden dome of Imam Ali catching the first light of morning on the horizon. Wadi Salaam is the largest cemetery on earth. It has been growing for 14 centuries. It will continue to grow for as long as people die, and families believe that the proximity of a holy man can ease the passage between this world and whatever comes after. Ask a Najaf gravedigger named Haider, or one of the dozens of men who have sat for interviews over the decades, and the answer comes back through the same understatement. The valley is not a place of rest, it is a place of activity. Something is happening in that ground. It has been happening for a very long time. The man finishes his tea. He pays for it. He walks back to the gate and waits for the next procession.